Hello and welcome to the Memory Card. Back in August of last year, I did a review of the Nintendo 64 controller and told you all that I backed the Kickstarter for Retrofighters making a modern redesign of the controller for the Nintendo 64. And now it's March, and earlier this month, the rest of the Kickstarter backers and myself included got our controllers in, and it's the Brawler64. And I'm going to tell you how this compares to the original Nintendo 64 controller. The Brawler64 controller comes in this box here, and I really like the graphic design on it. It's all really clean, and I like that it clearly shows the controller, and on the back here lists all the little details about it. It's all very professionally well done. No one's going to think it was an actual Nintendo product, but it still looks pretty good. And I initially backed this Kickstarter so I would have a Nintendo 64 controller that my friends wouldn't mind using so much, because they're not much of a fan of this pitchfork design here. Don't like having to hold it like this. I actually like the Nintendo 64 controller. My main problem is this thumbstick here. It just wears out very easily over time and just isn't as precise as more modern thumbsticks, which thankfully that's one of the things this controller fixes. This thumbstick feels a lot like the GameCube controller or the Wii Classic Pro controller. And also the Z button here, which is on the middle of the pitchfork, has now been split into two triggers, which you can use, doesn't really matter which one you use, they both do the same thing. But for some reason, it's an analog trigger, whereas this is just a button. I guess it was done just because people are more used to analog triggers rather than just digital triggers like on the Switch Pro controller, and it's something weird, but it's not a huge deal. And all the buttons feel nice. The A and B buttons are a little bit closer together and are matte finish instead of glossy and have a bit of a lower profile to them. And the C buttons are also bigger on this controller. And the D-pad is also something else that was a fair bit different on this controller. The D-pad is a little bit mushy, but honestly the D-pad's not really used much on Nintendo 64 games aside from the wrestling games and things like that. But everything works really well. The turbo button's really nice. You just hold that with any button that you want to turbo, and to fix that you just use the clear button and the button that's turboed. And all that works fine. Also, if you notice on the back, it has the same little input. So the controller pack, which is basically just a memory card, works fine, still fits flush. Take it out like normal. And the rumble pack also works perfectly fine. And actually is nice because it adds a little bit of weight to this controller, because the two handles here are hollow, so this controller feels very light. So putting in a rumble pack makes this feel a bit more substantial in the hands. Unfortunately, the transfer pack doesn't really work with this controller like it does on the usual Nintendo 64 controller. It doesn't really want to go in, and even if you could cram it on all the way, it just doesn't really have that compatibility, which is a shame if you want to have the full functionality for games like Pokemon Stadium, or I believe Mario Golf also has that, but again, not very many games use this particular accessory, so it might be a deal breaker for some people depending on what your particular use case is, but for me, I don't use this a whole lot, so it's not a humongous deal to me. Because my main thing was the thumbstick, and that's cured by this redesign here, and it feels a bit more modern, so my friends like this controller a lot more than this one over here, even though it feels a bit more substantial because of the weight and the plastic used. And I don't really have any big problems with this controller. The only real criticism I have is with the L button here. If you press it down and move this thumbstick around here, you can see the L button moving, and you can feel it moving under your thumb. Now, this is something that has been addressed by Retrofighters on the Kickstarter for this controller. For people that were affected by this and have a problem with this, they're working on sending out replacement parts. For me, this button's barely ever used on the Nintendo 64, considering it's way over here on the side that's barely ever used. So I don't really care that much, but all in all, despite a couple of minor problems, I really love this controller, and this is going to be the controller that I use primarily for all my Nintendo 64 games. This Retrofighters Brawler64 controller actually has me enjoying my Nintendo 64 even more than I already was. And there's a Kickstarter going on right now for the translucent colors. This is going to be going to retail with the regular gray, but There is also the translucent colors like red, green, blue, and purple if you want that. That Kickstarter is still going right now. I've already backed mine because I want the translucent blue and the purple. So that is available if you want it to get a little bit cheaper. Since I got my controllers, I've been playing hours upon hours of Nintendo 64 games, and that's partially so I could test out these controllers and see how they perform and feel while actually playing games. But that's also just because these Brawler 64 controllers honestly make playing the Nintendo 64 more fun. It's honestly, aside from the couple minor issues I brought up during my overview of these controllers, it's just a lot more comfortable to play games with these controllers. This thumbstick alone is a huge improvement, especially with the rubber cap on top of the thumbstick, keeps your thumb from slipping off or getting burns on your blisters on your thumb from playing Mario Party. I remember those, but that's a thing of the past now with this controller. And I definitely would say that after playing it with every Nintendo 64 game that I own, this is definitely my favorite way to play Nintendo 64 games. It definitely, I mean, the Virtual Console on the Wii and the Wii U is nice, but trying to play the Legend of Zelda games with, like, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask with controllers other than these or the 3DS just really isn't as comfortable because on the other controllers, they try and replace the C buttons with the right analog stick, and that works well for a lot of Nintendo 64 games, but for trying to play the Ocarina or switching between items, it just isn't as easy or comfortable just using the four buttons. So, this controller honestly is kind of what I wish would have shipped with the Nintendo 64. I think people would have probably liked the console a bit more had it released with a bit more of a traditional controller like this, but I will probably still use the original controller every now and then just for mostly nostalgia and until I get my other two controllers from Retrofighters after the Kickstarter ends for the translucent controllers. But I definitely highly recommend this controller, including its minor faults that it has. Some of them a bit more objective and others a bit more preferential, but if you didn't play much Nintendo 64 because you hated that controller, or if you do really like the Nintendo 64 and like the controller fine, I think you'll still like this controller even more. And I can't recommend this controller highly enough. But regardless, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on the memory card.